So, exactly how much money are you making in your jewelry reselling business? Do you know the exact breakdown of your costs and the fees involved as it relates to you reselling jewelry? This is something that I have struggled with on and off throughout my own jewelry reselling journey. And I know I can't be alone because, surprisingly, a lot of us are confused when we talk about how much money we're making and how much it actually costs us to be jewelry resellers, to have this business. So, today we are going to talk about jewelry reseller math. And I also want to talk about the fees. I really want to explain the fees involved as it relates to being a reseller. And we're going to cover several different platforms. The ones that I find are the most common as it relates to reselling jewelry. So today is going to be a little bit of a lesson, maybe a little bit of an explanation so we can figure out exactly how much money we're making because I say it all the time. That's what this is about. It's about us making money, hitting the goals we want to hit financially, in life, whatever the case may be. So that's what we're going to focus on today, jewelry friends. Hello. My name is Desiree, and you know that I am your jewelry reselling bestie. So, like I said, today we're going to be focusing on jewelry reseller math, one of my favorite and sometimes not so favorite topics because I'm not a money person. I'm not an accountant. I'm not someone who is really business savvy as it relates to this part. But I have learned some things over the years, and I'm going to share with you how you can figure this out, or at least how you can get a much more realistic view about what's coming in and what's going out as it relates to your money. And remember, this business is not just about the money we're making, it's also about the costs and the expenses involved and what it requires of us to make this money. And I think that's a part that a lot of resellers just don't consider, or maybe they don't think about, or maybe they don't take into account exactly how that affects their bottom line. All right, so I want to like I said, really go into this so we all have better expectations and a lot more clarity when it concerns running a jewelry resale business. All right, so before we get into that, I'd like to remind you to check out our website, jewelryresellerspodcast.com, because over there you can look at all kinds of stuff that I've got for you over there as it relates to the podcast. We also have goodgreatfabulous.com, and over there you can check out some of the jewelry pieces that I have for sale and some ebooks and e-guides that I think could be very helpful for you on this journey, especially if you are just getting started. I give you some tools and information to really help you grow your jewelry reselling business. All right, so let's go ahead and get into today's topic because we do have a lot to cover. And I just want to say this, most of us started reselling jewelry thinking that, we could flip pieces for a quick profit. And in some cases, that's entirely true. But like I mentioned earlier, no one really talks about how to figure out if you are actually making money. And I think this is so important because, yes, some of us do this for fun, but at the end of the day, we want to make money. All right. So, like I said, I'm not an accountant and I'm not someone who has this perfectly figured out, but I am someone who has learned things and I've learned a lot of things the hard way. And so I'm going to share that with you. So, hopefully, you don't have to go through the same struggles and challenges that I went through. Now, I am going to be including some visuals in this episode, but I'm going to do my best for those of you listening to the audio version. I'm going to try to be as descriptive as possible so that way you can still grasp the information that I'm going to be talking about today. But if you are listening to the audio version and you want to see the breakdowns and some of the charts that I'm going to be sharing with you later in this episode, you may want to hop on over to YouTube and watch the video version. All right, so let's go ahead and start with the first part of this episode. And I'm going to share with you a common misconception as it relates to what most resellers think is profit. All right. So remember, profit is everything that you keep after all of your business expenses have been deducted or have been accounted for. Okay, so we're not talking about revenue, which is just the money that comes in. We're talking about what you actually get to keep, your net profit. Okay, so let's think of this as an example. You buy a ring for $5 at the thrift store, antique mall, garage sale, wherever. You list it online and you sell it for $30. That's great, right? The platform takes a fee, and you may think, oh, okay, I made $20. After you take into account the fee of whatever the platform is, and then shipping. Let's just make it easy and say the shipping was $5. But now, while you may think you're pocketing $20, you're neglecting to include some things that are other expenses as it relates to you selling that ring for $30. Yes, maybe you only spent $5 to buy it, but what about all of the other hidden costs? All right, so I'm talking about supplies, right? You may have invested in supplies to clean the ring, polish the ring, size the ring, whatever. The shipping, we talked about that. But your time and effort to go ahead and find that $5 ring. You may have spent gas, driving your car around, the time it took you to actually look through the stuff that's for sale, and then your knowledge, right? Your skill set as it relates to you finding the ring and knowing that this is something that you could flip. We also talked about tools and unsold inventory, which I'll get into that in a little bit later, as well as the emotional effort, right? Sometimes this is an emotional roller coaster, finding things, getting excited, or sometimes being disappointed. So, in theory, yes, you find a $5 ring and you sell it for 30. You're not actually profiting $20 after all is said and done. It's actually a little bit less because all of those things that I just listed and that I just mentioned do have value and do have a cost. All right, so let's make sure that we are taking into account all of the ways that we are expending ourselves, whether it be financially, physically, mentally, emotionally. And remember, those things do have value. And in some cases, some of those aspects and some of those things could be directly related to a financial counterpart, right? So think about all of the costs, financial and otherwise, that it takes for you to run your jewelry reselling business. Okay, so we have a holistic view. Now, the other thing I want to go into is that a lot of these costs people don't think about, because I think so many of us think about, well, it's just about getting the stuff and then listing the stuff and then selling the stuff. And, you know, on the surface, that's not incorrect. But I think where so many of us get frustrated and disappointed is that we're not taking into account all of the other work, I guess would be the best way to say it. All of the other work that it takes in order to do this. Now, I talk about this all the time, right? So, it's not just about finding the jewelry, it's about sorting and organizing and then listing and photographing. And then what I was talking about this not too long ago. And here's the thing about reselling. You already are spending future time when you list an item. And what I mean by that is that, okay, so you list something on eBay, let's say, and it hasn't sold yet. But you know that in the future, when that item sells, it's going to cost you X amount of minutes, X amount of time in order to get that item processed, get it out to the buyer. So you're spending time now, but you're also forced to spend time in the future, and that needs to be accounted for. So remember, it's not just the time it takes to get the listing up, it's also the time a week later, a month later, a year later that it takes to process that order and get it out. All right. So, and that's like, you can't control that. You physically have to do it. So remember, that is also a cost of you doing your jewelry reselling business. And that is something that you need to take into account. So when you sell the item, you're not only thinking about what it takes to get the item sold, you're also thinking about what it takes to get that item, like I said, completely shipped out. All right, so we talked about time, which is the most valuable resource. Remember, you can't replace the time. We can always get more money. We can always get more stuff. We can always get more inventory. But time is the one thing that we can't save and we can't replace. So think about that. And it's not something that I think, I don't want to scare anybody or anything like that. But being a jewelry reseller is not passive income. I mean, I don't think anybody expects it to be, but I've heard other resellers say that this is semi passive. And I disagree because you're actually doing stuff, every step of the process in order to get the jewelry sold. All right. So with all this being said, track how much time you are spending on sorting, cleaning, testing, photographing, writing listings, answering questions, packaging the item, storing the item, processing the item once it's sold. And then even after it's sold, you still may have to track that item and make sure that it arrives safely. You may have customer service issues if somebody gets the item and something is there's an issue. So it's a linear process, but it's not a linear process of things back to back to back. It's like, oh, I'm spending time now, then there's a gap of time, and then I'm spending more time on this, and there's a gap of time, and I could be spending more time on that. So you have to think about this. It's kind of I don't know what the word would be, but it's like a long term process. Okay, so that's something to think about. And this isn't just specific to jewelry reselling, this is just reselling in general. All right, I talked about the shipping supplies, baggies, boxes, um, your business card, whatever, tissue paper, bubble wrap, bubble mailers, tape, labels, printer ink or thermal label rolls, all of that stuff. Okay, and I know a lot of us already know this, but I'm just throwing it out there to make sure you include it when we're thinking about jewelry reseller math. And remember, these are things that kind of add up every week, depending on the volume that you're selling. That may be a huge expense for you, or it could be something that, if you're not selling a whole lot of stuff every week, it may not be, something that you have to worry about that much. But it is still an expense. Also, the tools and equipment, jewelry testing tools, polishing cloths, storage boxes, lighting and photo setup, and jewelry displays if you use them. All of that, as well as your camera or your phone. A lot of us use our phones, so there is an expense with that. I mean, I know we're using our phone, for other things, but part of that is dedicated use towards your business. I also talked about this refunds, returns, and mistakes. Sometimes that could totally eat into your profit. I know I've had that happen where, somebody doesn't like something or it's broken or it's damaged or they want to return it. And so when somebody returns something, all of that work now, I mean, I hate to say the word wasted, but it was kind of done for nothing, right? Because I'm getting the item back and now I have to do the whole process over again to relist that item. Granted, you're not starting from scratch, but still, all of that work I did the first time got the item sold. But now all of that is, null and void because now I got the item back, but I got to relist it or I got to do another series of steps in order to hopefully find another buyer. So I don't want to discourage anybody, but like I said, I just want to keep it real so we have realistic expectations about what it's costing us to run a jewelry reselling business. All right, now the other expense that a lot of resellers don't talk about is inventory that doesn't sell. If it's been sitting around, if your jewelry's been sitting around for 6 months, a year, 2 years, is it really inventory? I mean, yes, it is, but it could also be in some cases just stuff, right? So you want to make sure you track your listing dates, keep track of how long stuff is sitting. And then remember, the whole concept of a thriving, profitable jewelry reselling business is stuff moving quickly, turnover. Now, it doesn't have to be fast turnover, but we do want to make sure that our stuff is not sitting for years on end. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted to cover as it relates to the true costs of being a jewelry reseller. Now I want to talk about the platform fees because I think this is something, I mean, even I was clueless for a long time. I just knew that eBay took a fee, Whatnot took a fee, Poshmark took a fee, and I kind of, had an idea of what the amount was, but I never knew exact down to the penny or what the exact percentage was. So I'm going to share that with you now. We're going to do a platform fee breakdown for eBay, Poshmark, Etsy, and Whatnot, because I think those are the main four platforms that a lot of us use as jewelry resellers. Obviously, if you use a different platform, you're going to want to double check the fees and the fee breakdown as it relates to that platform. But I think these four are the ones that most of us use. So those are the four I'm going to focus on in this part of the episode. So let's go ahead and start with eBay. Now, I will be throwing up some visuals, like I said. So I'm going to do my best to explain it for those of you listening to the audio version. And if you are, you always can come to the YouTube channel and see these graphics that I'm going to throw up. All right, so let's start with eBay. The final value fee for eBay in the jewelry category is 13.25% of the total sale. Now, remember, eBay takes final value fees on the total sale. So that is the price that the item sold, the tax on that item, and the shipping of that item. So eBay takes 13% of all three of those parts of the total sale. Now, we're not going to get into the why or if it's legal or if it's not. That's just what they do. All right. Now, the other thing is eBay also takes 30 cents per order, a fixed fee. All right. We're focused on the jewelry category here. That could be different in other categories, but when I looked it up, this is what I found. Now, optional fees. If you pay to promote that listing, that's typically an extra 5 to 10%, depending on how much you promoted that item for. If you have an eBay store, having an eBay store may lower your final value fees just a little bit. All right, so I know a lot of you have eBay stores, so you are getting a little bit of a break on your final value fees. Now, let's look at this example here. You sell a brooch for $25 plus $5 shipping. In this example, I did not include the tax, but for the sake of the example, that's okay. So that's $30 total, $25 for the brooch plus $5 flat fee shipping. You pay 13.25% of $30 because remember, eBay takes fees off of the sales price and the shipping and the tax. And that gives us a total of $3.98 plus the 30 cents, which is the per order fixed fee. And the total fees for that is $4.28. Now, it's going to be slightly higher, like I said, because I did not include the tax, but you guys get the gist. All right, so I'm going to say roughly it's about $5 or $6 on a $25 sale. Now, remember, this is just the fees from the platform. This is not taking into account all of the other things we just talked about, your time, your supplies, all of that. All right. So, yes, maybe you made roughly about $20, but don't ignore the other costs involved that it took to get this $25 brooch sold. Okay. So, when we think about that, the cost of, or I guess the profit on this particular sale is actually less. So we have to kind of think about that. All right. So that's eBay. Now let's move on to Poshmark. All right. There's a lot of jewelry resellers on Poshmark. I have sold on Poshmark for years. I like it because it's easy. But I'm also going to do a comparison of these platforms too. So make sure you watch until the end, because if you're curious to see which platform is better for you, I am going to compare each one. Okay. So now we're focused on Poshmark. Now Poshmark, their fee or commission for sales under $15 is a flat $2.95. All right, so if you make a sale of anything under $15, Poshmark is going to take roughly $3 of that. So this is another reason why I say you don't really want to sell any of your jewelry for less than $10. If you're selling it on Poshmark, less than $15 if you can, because $3, if you only sold that piece for $8 or $10, well, $3 of it is going to go to Poshmark right off the top. All right. And that's not going to leave you very much. And remember all the work and all the things it takes to get that item onto Poshmark in the first place. Now, sales over $15, Poshmark takes 20%, flat 20%. Now, a lot of resellers like Poshmark because this is so easy. It's just a flat 20%, doesn't matter what you sell. So let's look at the example here. We sell a necklace on Poshmark for $22, and that's going to mean Poshmark's going to take 20%. So if you sell something for $22, you will receive $17.60. All right. So, okay, we we can see that. Now, Poshmark covers shipping, but remember, the buyers pay for shipping. So when you are looking at pricing your jewelry on a platform like Poshmark, remember that the buyer's not just paying the $22. They're paying also, I think it's $8, eight something right now, in addition to that. So this jewelry piece, this necklace, the buyer is paying roughly about $30 for that. So the buyer's paying $30, but you're getting $17.60. So we have to also, even though the shipping is not coming out of our pocket as a seller, we still have to take into account how much the buyer is paying in order to purchase our item, our jewelry item. All right, so that's Poshmark, 20% fee. All right, so now let's take a look at Etsy. Now, full transparency, I have never sold jewelry on Etsy, although I do know a lot of resellers that do. I've heard mixed things about Etsy, so I've never really been motivated to try it. But here's the breakdown for those of you that are curious or who are currently selling on Etsy. All right, so Etsy charges a listing fee, 20 cents per item, and it's renewed every 4 months or when the item sells. There is a transaction fee, which is 6.5% of the total order, which includes the item sale price, the shipping, and the tax. So they do it just like eBay does. Then you also have a payment processing fee. This is for sellers in the United States. That payment processing fee is 3% of the total order price, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like I said, I don't sell on Etsy, so I'm not quite sure. So I hope that this information is correct. If it is not, please feel free to correct me in the comments. But it's 3% plus 25 cents for the payment processing fee. I'm going to assume it's for the total order, which is the item, the shipping, and the tax, because that just seems to be how these platforms work. All right, so let's look at the example. You sell a ring for $40 plus $5 shipping, that's $45. The tax is not included here. So 6.5% of $45 is $2.93. 3% of $45, yes. So that payment processing fee is for the total order amount. That's $1.35 for the payment processing fee, plus an additional 25 cents. And then remember, you have your listing fee, which is 20 cents. So this brings your total to $4.73. But remember, this is slightly higher because we did not include the tax. So I'm going to say this is roughly $5 and some change, maybe close to $6, depending. All right, so this was a $40 ring, and the Etsy fees are roughly about $5 ish. Okay, now that's not too bad. All right, that's not too bad. Now, the thing about Etsy is that the fees feel smaller at first, but they stack fast, when you have lower priced items. So make sure not to price your items too low on Etsy. And remember, I have said this before, that I don't think you should sell any jewelry for less than $10. If you don't have a piece you can get $10 for, bundle it with something else. Okay? All right, now let's take a look at Whatnot. Whatnot, the seller fee is 8% of the total sale. This is item plus shipping. Whatnot also charges a payment processing fee, which is 2.9% plus 30 cents. So in our example, we sell a pair of earrings for $18 plus $6 shipping. The total is $24. 8% of $24 is $1.92. 2.9% of $24 is equals 70 cents. Hold on, let me re-say that. 2.9% of $24 is 70 cents plus 30 cents, and that's the payment processing fee. So our total fees on Whatnot are $2.92. All right, so remember, shipping is also prepaid by the buyer on Whatnot, but it is part of the fee calculations. So make sure you're getting your shipping right, because you don't want to overcharge your buyer on shipping, because then you're overcharging yourself as it relates to the total fees. So that's something we have to be careful about, and something we need to pay attention to specifically on Whatnot. Well, actually, maybe on all of the platforms, except Poshmark, because the shipping is just a flat rate. Okay, so that's what we got as it relates to the fees of these 4 platforms. Okay, so let's do a summary. Let's look at this chart, and we're going to do a fee comparison for a $30 jewelry sale. So on eBay, the approximate fees are about $4.28, which is roughly about 14.3% of the total sale cost. And this could vary if you do promoted listings. All right, so that's something you may have to factor in if you also promote your listings on eBay. On Poshmark, the fee for a $30 jewelry sale is going to be $6, which is a flat 20%. All right, this is where I say a lot of people like Poshmark because the math is easy to figure out. They do take a higher cut, but it is a very simple fee model. All right, so for Etsy, the approximate fees are $4.73, which is approximately 15.8% of the total sale. And remember, with Etsy, these fees stack, especially with add-ons. So I think you can, pay a little bit more on Etsy for certain things, maybe promotions and things like that. Like I said, I don't sell on Etsy, so I don't know. But I have heard sellers complain like the fees are almost like never ending. So just keep that in mind as we're doing our comparison here. And then finally, Whatnot look at this. The fees are approximately $2.92, and that's approximately 9.7% of the total sales. So I've said this before, Whatnot is roughly about 10%. Lower fees, this is really good, but not everybody wants to do the live selling model. But this is one reason why I think so many people do live selling on Whatnot, because the fees are lowest in comparison to the other three big platforms that most resellers are selling their jewelry on. All right, so Poshmark is the highest, but it's also the simplest. eBay and Etsy, there's that fee stack. There's the final value fees, there's the payment processing fees, and then there's additional fees if you promote. All right, so keep all of that in mind. And then Whatnot has the lowest fees, but not everybody wants to do live selling. So that's something you got to think about as well. There's always a trade-off. There's always a pros and cons, pluses and minuses, positives and negatives, right? So you're going to have to really think what's going to work for me. And I know a lot of people just stick with eBay because it's the most familiar and that's where everybody is doing it. And some people, like I said, are just eBay loyalists. They're just not going to go anywhere else. And no matter what eBay charges as it relates to fees, that's where they're going to stay. So, but you don't have to. You do have options like we're talking about today. So remember, it's not about which platform is best. It's about knowing how much of your sale they keep. And remember, this is just the fees. This doesn't take into account all of the other things that it costs in order to get your jewelry sold. And we talked about those at the beginning of this episode. It's way more than the time. It's all of the expenses of running your jewelry reselling business. All right, so you really want to, and I talked about this in the last episode where I talked about your jewelry reseller mindset and, thinking about how much you're actually making per hour or per day. Because I think a lot of us, we think about how much are we making per sale, right? So if we made $50 or $60 profit in one sale, that's fantastic. But we also have to keep in mind how much work it took for us to get that, right? And how much of that really is true profit, true net profit. So here's something I wrote down in my notes. Would you work for $6 an hour at a part-time job? In today's in today's economy, probably not. And I don't even know if that's legal. I think minimum wage in a lot of places is at least, $10 an hour, give or take a dollar, whatever. So would you work for $6 an hour at a part-time job? Probably not. As a matter of fact, I'm going to confidently say probably none of us would do that. But if you are reselling 20 hours a week, and remember, we're talking about all those things that I mentioned in the beginning, and you're making $120, let's say, that's exactly what you're doing. Like you're working for about $6 an hour. So have you done the math to track how much you're making every week and then breaking down how many hours you're spending on your business every week and then doing the math to figure out how much you're making per hour? All right, because I know none of us got into this to barely make minimum wage or to make, to be in the negative. And trust me, I've been there too. There's been times where I have been surprised that I have actually been in the negative, you know, embarrassingly, embarrassing myself to admit that. But I've been there. I've been there because I didn't know how to figure all of this out. I didn't know like what the true cost of running a business was. I just thought, wow, I made a sale. I'm doing good. But that may or may not necessarily be true. And then if your sales are not consistent, that's even less true because now, if you're only doing one sale here, one sale there, you're still doing the work, depending on how you're running your business. And so most of us would not be working at a job for free or for less than minimum wage. So we have to make sure we have that same mindset approach as it relates to our business. Okay, so really think about this. And I'm hoping that this episode helps you to get realistic about the money you're making or not making in some cases, because I don't want anybody to lose money, and I don't want anybody to, be sitting on mountains of beautiful jewelry that they spent time, effort, and energy to accumulate, and then they're not getting, the return. They're not making the money. All right. So I really want to encourage you to maybe start setting weekly goals, weekly income goals. Like, for example, maybe you want to make $100 a week. Maybe you want to make $500 a week. And we're talking net profit. Okay. And sometimes you have to work backwards from that. Okay. So, and a lot of this too will depend on how many jewelry pieces you list and how many jewelry pieces you sell. And remember, I talked about in the how to price your jewelry for reselling episode that my sweet spot for jewelry sales is roughly between 20 and 40-ish dollars. Of course, that seems to be fairly doable for me with the type of jewelry that I can source and how much I can source and how often I can source. So if that were the case, then I would probably need to sell. If my goal was like, what, say $300 a week, and I would need to sell about two jewelry pieces with a $30 profit every day. I hope I, I hope I figured that out right in my head. Remember, I told you guys I'm not a math genius. I struggle with that. But I think that's right. I think I would need to sell about two $30 profit jewelry pieces a day every week in order to hit that goal. Right? Because that would be 60 times 7. Well, actually that might make me more. All right? So I would need to sell at least one, right? No, I would need to sell more. I'm just going to say I would need to sell two a day with a $30 net profit. All right? So that's not difficult to do, because when I was doing this, when I was seriously on my grind, and I was listing 25 to 30 pieces a day, I was hitting that goal. I was surpassing that goal. So I know it's doable, but it does take you figuring out what your goals are and then planning accordingly with your listings, your time, and your pricing. Okay. All right. So, oh, and make sure this is something I wrote in my notes too, comparing your time spent versus the income earned. I think that's what I was talking about earlier. All right. So take into account everything, you guys. Really, really think about this, okay? Because nobody's out here trying to work for free, and nobody is out here trying to be in the negative after doing all this work. Okay, so always pay attention to your net profits, pay attention to the income that you are earning, or at least trying to earn. Okay, and then finally, here's what I do keep track of now that I didn't really keep track of before. It's a lot of the stuff that we have already covered. How much I've talked about this in the bulk jewelry lot episode. How much each lot, the cost per piece of jewelry. So if I buy a bulk lot, sometimes you know how many pieces you get, sometimes you don't, but I always like to know what is the price per piece, how long it takes me to photograph and list, what platforms actually bring you the net profits. You guys know that I like to do live selling, so I'm all about Whatnot, Poshmark Live, and District. Your monthly supply costs, we have to factor that in, and then the time spent versus the income made, like I just talked about. All right, so you don't have to be perfect, and you don't have to figure all of this out today or right now, but I do want you to really consider how much money you're making and what it is costing you to make that money. And remember that um, everything has a cost, either a time cost or money cost. Sometimes it's both. And like I said, sometimes it's mental and emotional as well. So think about all of that, because a lot of resellers don't. But all of that is something that you are spending as it relates to you running and operating a jewelry resale business. Remember, jewelry reselling can totally be profitable. I know it can because I've done it. I know hundreds of you have done it. But you don't want to ignore your numbers. All right. I'm hoping that this episode really gave you a clear view of the costs of running this jewelry reselling business. You know, if you feel burnt out, or if you're wondering why you're not seeing the money, like I said, I hope this episode really equipped you to get it figured out. And if you need some help, um, I mean, you can reach out to me and I'll do the best I can. But if it's overwhelming, take it piece by piece. Like maybe you just start off tracking your time spent sourcing, your time spent listing, right? Turn the timer on your phone and see how long it takes. You know, track yourself and then write it down in a notebook so you know. So take a few minutes this week, look at your numbers. Like I said, really look, really study. It might be uncomfortable, but I'm telling you, it'll save your business and it'll help you make more money because, like I said, nobody's out here trying to work for free, right? Nobody is. Okay, so that is what I got for you, jewelry friends. I hope this episode was helpful. I hope it was enlightening. And if you have any questions, or if I got some of the information wrong, please, leave a comment so I can correct it, or maybe do a follow up, or an updated episode to make sure that my my math was right, because I don't always get it right. I don't always get it perfect, but I do try my best, like I said, to bring you the most current, up to date information as it relates to what we do. All right. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, observations, please leave them in the comments below, like I said. And please give this video a thumbs up and share it if you know somebody that could benefit from this information. I love to do this. I love to do the research. So I don't mind, like I said, being corrected, or diving deep into something else that you guys may need help with. All right. So I want to thank you so much for spending this time with me, and I will check in with you again really soon.